This is part one of the lecture, Revolution and Intervention in Central America. We're going to look primarily at Nicaragua and a little bit at El Salvador. But the one thing I want to start with is the notion that the Nicaraguan Revolution of the 1970s and 80s shows us a tremendous unity of 20th century Caribbean history. And it's one of these moments in which there really is a very unified Latin American experience. And a lot of that unity is driven by the relationship to the United States. Well, in the lecture that we looked at the horrible massacre, the Matanza in El Salvador, we saw that in the 1920s and 30s, the anti-imperialist struggle of Augusto Cesar Sandino in Nicaragua, that was very influential to many people in Latin America. And in fact, many Guatemalans in the late 40s and 1950s looked to Sandino, the great nationalist, he wasn't a communist, the great nationalist, for inspiration. But then what happened in Guatemala affected how Fidel and Che Guevara thought about what they were going to do in Cuba in the 50s and 60s. So they decided to go and be much more radical and to tie up with the Soviet Union because of what had happened to Guatemala. But the Cuban Revolution was inspiration for Nicaraguans in many, many ways. That young Nicaraguans tried to emulate what Fidel and Castro had done. But then when they came to power, they did that in the 60s. When they came to power in the late 70s, they didn't want to go as far as Fidel and Che did. And they openly talked about it. And Fidel visited Nicaragua and there were open conversations about it. So there's a lot of connection, even though they're taking different paths. But to the United States, they were all tarred as simply being communist. Now, the United States and Nicaragua had a very long and complicated history. Nicaragua was the original preferred route for the canal. It was going to go through Lake Managua. The U.S. had substantial investments in Nicaragua beginning in the late 19th century. And when Nicaraguan politics broke into the Civil War in the 1920s, the United States was so concerned with maintaining stability there that it intervened and occupied the country from 1927 to 1934. Now, Sandino, who fought the U.S., was an elite who became a nationalist hero. And the United States looked at Nicaragua and said, you know what one of the problems in Nicaragua is? Unlike the United States, many Latin American countries have militaries that are involved in the day-to-day of politics. And we know from thinking about bureaucratic authoritarianism that continues. So the United States, after it left Nicaragua, decided that what it wanted to do to promote stability was to remake its army. And so the U.S. government decided to create a whole new army called the National Guard, and that it would be apolitical the way the U.S. military was. It wouldn't be in politics, but that was foolish because it became the most powerful, best-funded institution in a country with very few effective institutions. So the National Guard, beginning in 1937, took over. And the head of the National Guard was Anastasio Somoza Garcia, whose nickname was Tacho, and his last name was Somoza. He ruled from 1937 until his death, and he was murdered in 1956. He became an incredibly close ally to the United States, Anastasio Somoza, the senior, Tacho. This is a picture of him riding in a car with Franklin Roosevelt. He was a key Cold War ally. He'd been an ally during World War II, obviously, but during the Cold War, he helped organize the coup in Guatemala in 1954. He provided bases for the U.S. military's Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba in 1961. And the National Guard the Nicaraguan National Guard worked very closely with the United States in counterinsurgency throughout the hemisphere. But in the 1950s, as it had in Cuba, opposition grew to the Somoza regime. And he was assassinated, the father, Tacho, by a young Marxist activist and poet, Rigoberto López Pérez. Somoza's eldest son, Luis Somoza Debayle, took over, and he faced multiple coup attempts that were violently suppressed. And middle-class groups were increasingly opposed to the Somoza regime. One of these middle-class groups was led by the editor or the publisher of the largest newspaper, La Prensa, a guy named Joaquim Chamorro. And he becomes important because his widow becomes a president of Nicaragua many years later. Well, that's Luis Somoza Debayle, who took over from his father, continued his politics, and died of a massive heart attack in 1967. And he was followed by his brother, Anastasio, who's on the left there. And he was known as Tachito, the little Tacho. And you see him in a uniform. He was actually a graduate of West Point, because this shows how closely integrated the government was with the United States. But, influenced by the experience in Cuba, young, middle-class Nicaraguans founded the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the FSLN, and they began an armed opposition to the Somoza regime in 1962. They consciously said that they were going to use Che and Fidel's FOCOS, the Foquismo method. But in the aftermath of Castro's victory, the U.S. troops understood how to deal with the problems of a FOCO. And U.S.-trained troops, Nicaraguan troops, easily defeated these guys. But they didn't give up. They reorganized into something called prolonged popular war. And what they said is, we're going to organize in the cities, and we're going to organize among people in the rural sector, and we're going to have a slow national organization against the status quo here in Nicaragua. And then something literally came out of the blue and changed everything. In 1972, there was a massive earthquake that destroyed huge segments of Managua. That's Managua, the capital city, right after the earthquake. You see things are still smoking. This was the typical sort of damage many houses and businesses faced. And in the aftermath of this earthquake, the worst aspects of the regime came out. International relief funds flowed in, but they were largely stolen by members of the National Guard. There was little or no reconstruction. There was almost no aid to the poor. And Somoza and his allies bought up crippled businesses for pennies on the dollar. Now, I said crippled businesses. So the business community was suffering, not just because without rebuilding they didn't have a market for their goods, they didn't have customers, but they were literally losing their businesses to the regime and its cronies. But international attention was drawn to Nicaragua because of two unique people. The first was the great Puerto Rican baseball player Roberto Clemente, who was a Pittsburgh Pirate, a Hall of Famer. He was just a phenomenal human being, as well as being a great ball player, and he died in a plane crash bringing relief supplies to Nicaragua, and he's honored on a stamp in 1984. That's him. But also, the Rolling Stones lead singer Mick Jagger's wife, Bianca, is his then wife, they're no longer married, is Nicaraguan, and she helped organize rock concerts for earthquake relief. And between Clemente and the Rolling Stones, tremendous international attention is now being focused in the mid-1970s on this corrupt regime. And so therefore, there was more and more domestic and international opposition to Somoza. And it really coalesced around the issue of corruption, not democracy, just simply corruption. Elites were questioning Somoza's government's failure to rebuild, and businesses that were losing out to the National Guard, really wanted to get rid of these guys. And the FSLN, which took its name from Sandino, who was a great nationalist, seemed much more nationalist than leftist. And that's, as I said, was keeping with the legacy of Sandino. So rather than start a bloody war, the Sandinistas moved to embarrass the regime. There are several examples of this. An early one was in December of 1974, guerrillas took control of a really elaborate Christmas party being held by Somocistas, in other words, people tied to the regime. They didn't kill anyone, but they kept these people prisoner, and they said, we're going to keep them prisoner until you release a bunch of our comrades, 14 political prisoners, give us $1 million in cash, which in 1974 was worth a tremendous amount of money. We wanted our program, our platform publicized on the radio and in newspaper, and we get safe passage guaranteed by the Red Cross to Cuba. They got all these things. And in a way, very much as Castro and Guevara had shown the weakness of the Batista regime through the FOCOS, they showed the corruption and the weakness of the regime through this kidnapping. They showed how Somocistas were living high on the hog, eating phenomenal food in virtual palaces while people were starving, and that the government would do anything to protect them, including publicize the Sandinista program and give them safe passage to Cuba.